it's really impossible to tell how it's going to change everything, other than the fact that we know it absolutely will change everything. That's all we really know, and it makes it so much harder to, there are so many more people who are in a much more difficult situation. I was talking to a friend here who, who has family still in rebel-controlled parts of Syria, and he was telling me about, on top of everything else, having to worry about them fleeing the violence that was taking place last month, towards the Turkish border. And on top of that, right now, he's worried that they're in this refugee camp where it's impossible to do anything like social distancing and staying away from people, washing your hands regularly to keep away the virus.
Yeah.
And he has to worry about that on top of everything else. So yeah, it feels like the last thing we needed was a pandemic, on top of everything else. Although, I mean, ironically, it is, putting some level of quiet and rest in terms of the usual conflicts that we're used to seeing, and maybe that's going to be for the better. Maybe once people are quarantined for a bit, and they get a chance to reflect and to breathe, for lack of a better word, after all of that, maybe we'll start reassessing a little bit what really matters and whether all these conflicts we're engaged in and enduring are worth it in the long run.
I like that you phrased it. It's almost like a cautionary optimism, and that it's giving us time to maybe re-examine our priorities. I want to ask you maybe the flip side to that. Is there any hesitation in that, because this came out of nowhere, and because it more or less stalled and then stopped the recent protest movements we saw sweeping the region, particularly in Lebanon, but also in Iraq and Iran to a degree, that this may have the unintended consequence of preventing change that a lot of us saw at least beginning in October and November last year? Like, could the coronavirus, in addition to making us reflect, also perhaps delay or even at some point kill the recent sort of momentum that we saw for change, for actual political change?
That's certainly a risk. I think what's probably going to end up happening is going to very much be dependent on the reaction of the region's governments to what's happening. And I think the coronavirus pandemic is actually going to expose a lot more the inefficiencies, whether it's in terms of the public health systems, whether it's in terms of the proper response to a crisis situation, whether they are successful in in enacting all these measures that are needed to keep us safe, while also making sure to keep people out of poverty. I think their inability and failure at building a proper social safety net is actually going to be exposed by the pandemic and by the ensuing economic chaos, and by the fact that so many people have to stay at home and will be unable to work. I think all of that is going to end up exposing the deep rot at the heart of many of these governmental institutions, and in fact, I think it's going to end up leading to a more sweeping, more powerful protest movement in its aftermath, I think. But it's all, but it's all going to depend, I think, on the response that these governments have, and whether they get their get their shit together, so enough to be able to actually respond effectively to the pandemic.
So in other words, the hesitation, and maybe this is looking at Lebanon in particular, but we can sort of expand from there, that there's almost this knee-jerk reaction to go back to what's familiar. And that's a Lebanese sort of trait, that anytime we've had sort of calls for change or reform or sort of accountability, and for that matter, sovereignty, all these things that have been on the table before, there's that inertia to take back to where we sort of, what we know kind of works and has worked to a degree at some point in our history. Could that happen here? That because of the economic crisis that we saw building up to the October 17 outburst of emotion, that maybe for the time being there will be a reluctancy to challenge authority. And I mean this in a universal trait. It's not just Lebanon, it's not just the region. I mean, you saw Hungary a few days ago, sort of almost embracing dictatorship. I mean, I don't want to get too sort of go all the way here, but it was a stark reversal of democratic trends the last 30 years in Eastern Europe. And suddenly Hungary's back to this authoritarian model. Other countries seem to be more embracing the idea of borders more and more. And it's sort of like coronavirus is the biggest issue right now. Whatever it takes to end the coronavirus, even if that means letting go of genuine aspirations, or even for that matter, dignity. Is some of that in the mix here, that perhaps protesters would want to feel comfortable as opposed to confront?
Yeah, there's a couple of things there. I think with cases like Hungary, and even cases like in the States, just the emergence of Trump and other nationalistic strongmen as a political force. I don't think they invented the trends that they came to embody. I think they tapped into or amplified an existing trend in society, and they took advantage of it in order to achieve the political offices that they managed to achieve. And so in a sense, Hungary was headed towards, that form of authoritarianism, as is Turkey, as are other countries, in both Europe and farther afield, in the US as well, and in South America, in Brazil, as an example. On the one hand, I do think that some of these trends existed beforehand, and they're probably going to accelerate because of the all the different authoritarian-esque rules that need to be imposed in order for the virus to be combated effectively. Another aspect of it is, there are different relationships that people all over the world have with their own governments.
Right.
When it's people more naturally skeptical of government instructions in a place like the U.S. In Canada, there hasn't really been a huge resistance from a political point of view to orders to shut down businesses and to essentially halt the economy. But there has been resistance to attempts at overreach, and gathering greater power during recent bills that were being passed to stimulate the economy, that the Trudeau government tried to gain more power through them, and those attempts were pushed back against. So that's one aspect of it. I do think it's the challenge is going to be, I believe, that we are going to grow more accepting of various surveillance technologies, because because the trade-off in terms of the greater good versus the loss of privacy is going to be more clear as time goes on. So I think people are going to be more accepting of technology that tracks people who are supposed to be under quarantine, and who are instead going about and infecting other people, and the realization that this is not for the greater good, and that it is for the greater good for the government to be able to track those individuals. So I think certain technologies like facial recognition, like location management, like broad-based societal surveillance, I think. I think those are going to be end up being more acceptable, and I think people are going to feel that those technological solutions are worth giving up their individual privacy for. More broadly, I think it's going to really be indicative of a broader change in the society. This understanding that our own individual good relies on the good of the rest of the community around us, and so there's going to be an evolving understanding of our relationship to everybody else. I don't know if it will necessarily lead to more authoritarianism. It probably will lead to more measures that take into account the communal good versus the individual good. And that's going to be, I think, an important transformational force in Western societies more broadly.
So in other words, the pandemic has just paused the politics of the moment, but there's a consequence which is more in terms of intrusion and state authority, but the demands are still there, that you can't just sort of take the demands off the street and assume things will sort of go back to the way they were 7 or 8 months ago. But you do have a technological story here, that there's authoritarianism is really the winner, so to speak, of the moment.
Yeah, I mean it's pretty clear at the moment that there are all these measures that are obviously being put in place to ensure that people comply with all these shelter in place or social
Right.
isolation orders,
Yeah.
and there needs to be a way to enforce them, right? And right now it means police are in the streets in some countries, the army's in the streets. They're forcing people through the use of force to comply with all these orders. The question is, in every single case in which a government or an authority has seized more power over time, if we're looking at more modern era examples, in the post 9/11 U.S. and UK, all of these governments seized power and they never ceded it. They always build upon it, right? And so there's going to need to be some sort of societal pushback in the aftermath of the pandemic to try and regain some of those powers. But I do think our mode of thinking will fundamentally change, where we're going to have to ask ourselves the question of whether this is actually what we want as a society, or if the good of the society as a whole, even if it involves ceding some measure of privacy and an individual liberty for the good of everyone, is going to be worth the trade-off.
You just remind me of the Patriot Act. There's no discussion of even challenging it today. It's almost sort of taken for granted. It's for better or worse, it seems to be permanent. That there's
absolutely, and it's
yeah,
absolutely, and it's not just a trend with the U.S. I mean, there's no government that has been given extraordinary powers that has wanted to cede it voluntarily.
Absolutely.
So and it hasn't happened among American presidents who've over the years have expanded their own authority and their own power through various means. It's just right now it's even more obvious, and the person who's in charge is a bit of a lunatic. So so it's more clear, it's more concerning. Not a lot of people thought about this when Obama was in charge, or when many other presidents were in charge before him that who seemed to agree with the general liberal consensus of policy making. It's just that now it's a bit like what a U.S. politician described as an adult daycare, right?
It's almost like the personality is more important at the moment than the policy itself. Although that policy is sort of consistent from the Bush years through to today. And I in that whole mix, 9/11, the aftermath, and then of course the invasion of Iraq and the occupation. I think you tell me if this is wrong. All of the stories that we're discussing today, when it comes to the Middle East, all the narrative, all the motivation, whether it's from the state or from the people, is a byproduct of that moment in time, where America sort of became more involved in the Middle East. And then our years growing up and then sort of maturing into separate careers, but that more or less dance around that subject, we've seen a disinterest, almost a retreat from that part of the world. That's really the last 2 decades of history. In that, I would like to explore your story. First, I'd like to know, because it's really the first time we've spoken in many years, what took you to the world of journalism? And then through that, what took you to the Syrian story? And through that, I want to really explore Syria through your eyes, Syria today, and everything that has been left off of the news to a degree since the coronavirus pandemic began. So let's go back to the beginning, at least through you. What took you to the world of journalism?
Yeah, I started out with zero intention of getting into journalism.
I wasn't go that far, but I don't remember even that. Yes, so I'm glad. So there was
yeah,
a sort of
yeah. I mean,
dream.
my growing up, I always wanted to be like an astronomer. I wanted to study about space and.
Just let the audience see what's right behind you. That little.
Right. Yeah. It's a poster. It's a poster of a spaceman dancing with a guitar. It's right in the back over there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, have you ever seen the video of Chris Hadfield, the astronaut who was playing Space Oddity on the space station?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Of course.
Yeah. He's a hero of mine. But I mean, I grew up with my father bought me lots of books about space, and I was super into that growing up, and I'd always wanted to be an astronomer. It ended up not being a possibility. Oh, there you go.
I have my own sort of,
Yeah.
but I'm on the wrong month. I should update to April. Yeah.
Well, I mean, March was so long, right?
Yeah, yeah. It feels like it's multiple pages. It's so
Oh man,
funny.
the year that was March. Yeah.
The April is more appropriate. Yeah.
Ah, that's uh, yeah. I mean, that's what I wanted to do growing up. It didn't. It wasn't an option really at the university where I ended up studying. Ended up studying in. I grew up in Dubai.
Mm.
Ended up going to the American University in Sharjah, which is in the next emirate down, which had a really fantastic engineering program. So I thought that the best way to go about it was to join an engineering
Mhm.
degree.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, the way we were taught was very similar to old school Arabic teachers and professors, where it was less about being creative and problem solving, and it felt more like we say in Arabic telqeen.
Yeah, exactly.
It was a little bit more memorization than creativity.
Yeah.
And I gravitated a little bit towards the journalism program because I started writing for an Egyptian sports website. I'm originally Egyptian. I was born in Alexandria,
Mm. Yes.
and I started writing about Egyptian football, and
So it's really like that because that's the first hint of storytelling. It comes through
yeah.
sports. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, the website I was writing for was mostly targeted at Egyptians in the diaspora, so I was writing in English,
Right.
so I started taking mass communications courses in class and journalism classes. I had a fantastic professor called Joe Gibbs, who was a former crime reporter for the Boston Globe. And he would fail you an entire assignment if you misspelled a single word. And he would give you, deliberately complicated names to try and get you to stumble in the writing. And so he taught me very early on the importance of accuracy and getting all the facts right
Right.
when I'm
Right.
reporting or when I'm writing a journalistic story. I still intended to go to work as an engineer at that point, but one day we had a class in which a journalist from the New York Times, who later became my first editor, came to visit our class, and it was
Oh, wow.
around I believe it was 2007 or maybe late 2006, and he came to visit our class, and he gave a talk about getting stuck in Lebanon when the 2006 war began.
Oh, wow.
Uh, yeah, he was visiting on either a minor assignment or to visit some friends, and while he was there, the war broke out. Airport was closed, and so he got stuck covering the war.
Mm-hmm.
And he told us the story from the end of the war, in which he was visiting a mass funeral,
Yeah.
and he stays behind and has this conversation with a man who was still there, waiting around the gravesite, and starts up a conversation with the man, and the man tells him eventually that he had buried his wife and his daughter on that day. And I remember at that moment knowing that this is the kind of story I wanted to tell, that I wanted to uh, be able uh, to hear stories from people who've gone through such incredible suffering and who exhibited such great resilience,
Mm.
and wanting to get their stories out to the world. And
So this was really
that's
just it was like a good academic moment where you have somebody who's done this for a living sharing that moment with you, and that's what drew you into the at least the human suffering part of it, because it's a very nice sort of opening into a world of otherwise it's a very difficult and stressful and emotionally sort of very challenging terrain. And it's when I hear football and I hear astronomy, I think of something that's a lot, even though they're difficult in their own way, and astronomy is its own journey, but that there's not much of the testing of emotional patience and suffering in that sort of world. That this is a lot sadder, if that's the right word. But that's
Yeah.
well, what is it about the? I mean, is it the politics of the story more than the actual human story itself, or is it simply just the human side to it, regardless of the politics?
Yeah, it was always about the individual stories.
Mm.
I, I mean, I had to report on the geopolitical, importance of the various events that I covered.
Yeah.
You had to almost justify why you're reporting on a particular story because of
Mm,
the
mm, mm.
bigger story that it told.
Right.
But to me, it was always about those individual stories. I found human beings fascinating, and the idea that it would be my job to just go find interesting people and listen
Yeah.
to them tell me stories about their lives
Mm.
was incredibly appealing to me. And the astronomy side of it can feel like why should I care about things up there when things down here are so blown to
Yeah.
shit, right?
To a degree.
um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, but I always thought that it was a really good way to kind of take a breather and look up,
Mm,
instead of looking
mm,
down
mm.
at all the misery that we ended up reporting on. And I always feel like if you really immerse yourself in just the pure tragedy and heartache that the region often exhibits, you
Yeah.
end up missing a lot of beautiful things. And I think aspects like side interests in something like astronomy, help you see, just the finer lines, right, in what goes on and the broader tapestry instead of just the individual, blood-soaked part of the fabric, right?
I
Uh,
I could not agree with you more. And I think as somebody who has this sort of amateur level of understanding when it comes to astronomy, I think that moment where we saw the black hole for the first time to me was as profound as any sort of human tale that we've heard the last few years. I mean, to me, that was it's sort of it's neutral enough that you can't really have an opinion on it, and it doesn't take its toll. It's just a moment of absolute wonder and joy, and it does sort of let you sort of lift your head above the water. And there's it's a very it's almost like a therapeutic dislodge from the pain that we know too well.
Yeah, I mean, whenever I want to like have a good cry, I go back and watch this video of the launch of I forget which exactly which mission it was to Mars, but it was a mission that involved a landing that had this like multi-step process that was just extremely cumbersome and difficult to get right.
Yes.
And
Yeah, yeah.
but I remember when it happened, I woke up to like watch it live on NASA TV, and
Yeah.
and just the moment when they actually get the message, because obviously it takes a few minutes from when it happens to
Right, right.
the news to
Yeah.
arrive back on Earth, and just the moment when there was like this 7-minute wait,
Yes.
until they found out if it had landed properly or not. And then when it did, and they got the news that it had landed, and just the pure joy and excitement and just pride in their accomplishment just like burst forth,
Yeah.
on the screen. And I remember like just kind of bawling my eyes out,
Yeah.
watching
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
that moment. And every
Absolutely.
time I need a good cry, I always go back and watch that video, because it's just it signifies all this achievement, right?
And these are tears of joy. This
Yeah,
is a
yeah,
different.
yeah.
Yeah, it's crying from it's relief. It's not sort of it's not dark. On the contrary, it's very light and very very
Absolutely
happy.
not. I mean,
Yeah.
and like right now, I always go. There's this video that has just come out of the Rotterdam Philharmonic Orchestra, in which because of social distancing, they all have to practice in their own
Yeah.
homes,
Right.
and so
Right.
they did this video collage that is, all of them together playing the Ode to Joy from their individual,
Yeah.
houses,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's just this incredible performance, and every time now I see videos of people together, it just brings me to tears, because it's like a human
Absolutely.
experience that that is no longer really available to us right now. Yeah,
Absolutely. So you're in a way you're choosing to become a journalist at the right time, so to speak, when it comes to covering a very important story. And this is just a few years before the Arab Spring begins. And you are literally, I mean, you're covering, I think, the most tragic of the Arab Spring stories, which is the Syrian war. Um, I know it's a big subject. I know it's been almost 10 years, if not 10. I know there's a lot of things to discuss here, so I'm going to try to compress it, only not to just not to remove the human suffering portion of it, because that deserves its own sort of revision later. I think that's sort of that's the darkest of the stories when it comes to Syria. The sort of the inability to fully comprehend the human tragedy to that story. But in that world, I want to get into what you did, because not too long ago, I think this was late last year, it could be around the time the Lebanese protests were starting. You shared a very emotional piece, for lack of a better word, a post about how the Syrian war took its toll on you, and that how you were, in a way, suffering in your own isolation in Montreal pre-coronavirus, that it had sort of sucked your soul dry to a degree. I'm not going to speak on your behalf here, but it touched me because I know that you're not the only person who has tried to expose the pain and suffering, all the human stories when it comes to Syria. And there's been an ambivalence over the years to that story. That does not discredit the quality of journalism. It is just a matter of fact that the audience has grown immune to that tragedy. Let's start at the beginning. The initial years, the moments where a lot of us thought that things were changing for the better. 2011, 2012. Did you believe back then, this is hindsight, that things were going to be optimistic, that things were moving in the right direction when it comes to Syria in particular, that these protesters that we saw the first weeks, the first months, trying to reclaim their dignity, that they would have a better future? Did you see that on the horizon, going back in time now?
I was absolutely just in awe, of the courage that people were displaying. I was in a sheltered existence. When I graduated, I started working in the UAE for the National, which is an Emirati newspaper, and I still write columns for them today about Syria. And so when I started covering, the Arab Spring, it wasn't, directly reporting on it. It was mostly kind of reporting on the reactions that were happening in the Gulf to what was going on. I was at the time. Right. And I was at the time covering foreign policy, covering politics and things like that. And in the months leading up to the Arab Spring, it was I wrote a lot of articles about reforms and changes to the to the Federal National Council, which was sort of the Emirati Parliament. I wrote about demands for more people to be able to vote, for more powers, the FNC, and things like that. Once the Arab Spring started, much of that was became it was sort of like relegated to the background. It was very difficult to really write about anything politics related at the time. And and so the focus was on the reactions of the Arab countries of the Gulf countries in particular, towards what was happening beyond the region. And at the time, even in the Gulf states, there wasn't this, at least in the popular level, there wasn't this suspicion of what was going on. The uprisings that were happening in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, in Syria, were just seen for what they were, which was, spontaneous expressions of popular, just giving up on everything that's been, keeping them down for so long, and just a demand for dignity and a say in their lives. Yes. And a lot of people identified with that, and they felt it was a very legitimate and just demand. And so, on a popular level, you didn't really see a lot of people who were, suspicious of why there were uprisings, or why people were revolting, or why people were going out in the streets. Even officially, there wasn't the level of kind of fear and concern that would emerge later on as the aftermath of the uprisings unfolded. I covered the session of the GCC that called for a no-fly zone over Libya, which was the initial impetus, for the Arab League to take up that call, and for then the UN Security Council to take up that call, and to launch, the intervention in Libya. And at the time, it was just seen as, as a pure let's protect, these people from this tyrant who's saying that he wants to go, avenue and who wants to go to every corner of the country and stamp out these cockroaches, as he described them. Eventually, when it became really hard to report on anything, particularly after the Bahrain uprising began,
Right.
I decided to leave the region for some time. At the time, I had an opportunity to work with the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, which was investigating the series of political assassinations in Lebanon that happened in between 2005 and 2008. And it was also an opportunity to kind of expand my horizons a little bit, to see other things, to go to other places. And I had spent my entire life in the Middle East, and hadn't been beyond that, and it was an opportunity to do so. I spent a couple of years there, and because of the knowledge I had built over time about what had happened in Lebanon over the years, and the political situation there, and was closely, obviously, following the news of what was going on in Syria in particular, and Egypt, which was my own country. I decided to go back to being a journalist and to trying to report on what was happening, and Lebanon seemed like the best place to resume that career.
Right.
It was really a difficult time. When I arrived in Lebanon, it was June 2013. And so Hezbollah had just, formally, obviously they had been part of the war in Syria for some time by then, but they formally announced that they were intervening in Qusayr, at the time the border town
On the
near Homs.
borderline, yes, yeah.
Yeah, and they
sorry, on the border between Lebanon.
between Lebanon and Syria,
Yes.
and they announced formally that they were intervening on the side of the Assad regime, and at the time when I arrived, it was the beginning of the backlash towards that decision. Obviously there was quite a significant number of Syrian refugees in Lebanon by that point, but also it was the beginning of a terror campaign by various Al-Qaeda affiliates, who were carrying out attacks in Shia majority areas in Beirut. There was a revival of clashes in Tripoli, obviously between the Alawites and the Sunnis there. There were clashes in Sidon as well between Salafist groups like Ahmed al-Asir's group with the Lebanese state. And I was there, and I was Egyptian, and being Egyptian kind of gives you some level of immunity from people's preconceptions towards journalists in Lebanon. I was working for a local newspaper. I was working for the Daily Star at the time. And everybody has an assumption about, because every Lebanese TV station or news outlet usually has a political affiliation, right? Some are more clear than others, obviously. But when you go as an Egyptian, everybody kind of projects their belief system onto you.
But they're projecting they want to know your views on Egypt, I'm guessing, and that's
well, but they don't ask you your views on Egypt. They assume that they know what your views on Egypt are, and they assume that they align with their interests. So, for example, Christians would assume that I am pro-Sisi. Sunnis would generally assume that I'm pro-Brotherhood. And Shia Lebanese would assume that, because in Egypt we venerate the Prophet's family, because of Egypt's history as a Shiite country before Salah ad-Din, took power in it. So we have all these shrines for Ahl al-Bayt, the Prophet's family. So the Shia assume that you're also
literally this is not a woman. This This is a win-win-win situation.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely. I never had any issues, and also the Egyptian accent often, elicits, good memories because
sure.
people,
Yes, of
yeah,
course.
people
Yeah,
remember the TV soap operas and shows that they watched in Egyptian,
yeah.
they were kids, and so it creates this immediate connection. Although a lot of people expect you to tell jokes right away. Uh, but it made it really easy to to go anywhere in Lebanon.
Yeah.
I didn't have any issues going and reporting in Tripoli in the middle of a clash that was unfolding, or going to Sidon and reporting on the violence there, going to any of the Palestinian refugee camps whenever there were any clashes or fighting, reporting on bombings in areas controlled by Hezbollah. And so very quickly Lebanon was this just it was this incredible place that really made me who I am, that shaped who I am as a person to a great extent. And obviously, covering what was happening in Lebanon at the time was never divorced from what was going on in Syria. Next door, there was Lebanon was always living in under Syria's shadow, even when Syria was broken.
These years at the Daily Star, was it? I mean, when it came to at least the Syrian story, were you reporting on that human level, sort of the suffering of Syrians in Lebanon as refugees, as displaced? As I mean, was it less politics, more human in that sense when it came to at least those years? Because Daily Star to me, I mean, everyone knows somebody that's been through the Daily Star. It has sort of hundreds of journalists have made their names through that newspaper, and unfortunately, it's going through difficult times
Yeah.
due to the economic crisis and many things. But was that sort of the way for you to begin exploring the human side to the Syrian story, or was that already there? Was that sort of that you were already certain that you wanted to sort of go that route?
Yeah, I mean, it was always an element of my reporting. I didn't go
Mm.
to, you know, I mean, I'm sorry to bring this up, but I mean, I covered your father's assassination when I was in Beirut, and some of the like I still remember individual elements of the scene there. The trees, one particular line was had its leaves burnt off because of the direction of the explosion, and it was always those
I know exactly what you're talking about.
it was
Yeah.
always those individual signifiers of something that had been broken and something that had been lost,
Yeah.
that to me were always the most important element that I wanted to reflect on and to observe.
Yeah.
Um, and to give you the example of
I mean, for better or worse, I don't know
I
if it's visible. Maybe it shows, I think, in the
I
background.
thank you for
Yeah.
yeah it shows
Yeah.
it shows, and I thank you for having his picture up there.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Sorry, I
yeah.
interrupted. So
No,
please.
no, no, not at all. I got to spend quite a bit of time with your brother in the immediate aftermath
Mm.
of the assassination, and I spent quite a bit of time talking to him then and afterwards too. And it's a relationship I cherish. And you guys have incredible resilience, and it means and I didn't get a chance to tell you this, but it means an enormous amount for me to be here talking with you, because I can't imagine going through an experience like the one you went through, and yeah, and I'm just filled with love for you, for your brother, for your wonderful mom. You guys welcomed me into your home. Um, at such a difficult time, and it's always going to mean so much to me that you did.
You're being way too generous and way too kind, Kareem. And you're whatever, for
Uh,
better or worse, your journalist skills are going to almost bring me to tears. So don't get any deeper, otherwise this is gonna end in complete tragedy.
I don't want that.
I'm
I
going
just
I'm going to deflect and reverse it. the honor is mine to be talking to you.
That's
So
very kind of you. Yeah, but I mean, it's, to give you an example of the, Syrian refugee issue, for example, it was, even then there was donor fatigue. Even then people were saying that we're bored or tired of reading of stories about the suffering of
and that's
Syrian
only
refugees.
less than 3 years into the war. So it's really
Yeah,
the
yeah.
out. Yeah, yeah.
100%. And so, constantly we had to figure out new ways of telling the story. We had to figure out, just a way to tell it in a compelling way that draws people in, that gets people to experience what it is exactly these individuals are going through. And I remember one of the first stories I did for the Daily Star about the refugee crisis. There was a winter storm that was coming into Lebanon around, I think it was November 2013, and it was called Storm Alexa,
Oh yeah.
which is yeah, it was a very odd name for a storm, but
Before Google's little friend
yeah,
emerged. Yeah.
exactly. And we were thinking of ways to cover, the its impact on refugees without, saying like X number of refugees live in Lebanon. Their tents are going to overflow and many people are going to die, from freezing to death. So, I asked the newspaper and they agreed to this, and I went and spent the night in one of the refugee camps with one of the families, to kind of give people an insight into how they lead their lives, into the conversations that they were having about the storm, and about how they were going to survive, during this winter weather. And it was, one of the most widely read stories that I wrote for the Daily Star at the time. At that moment, I really understood that when you sort of move past like the global geopolitics of any particular crisis, people start to identify with what you're talking about. People can understand the level of human suffering when you're talking about an individual, who has, like three daughters and a boy, and they're all worried about freezing to death up in the mountains. It's a lot more easy. It's a lot more simple to comprehend that as a concept than it is to comprehend the suffering of a million people,
so
that you
like in
don't
other
really know
words,
what to talk
one boy's tragedy, and I mean that image, it's permanent. The child sort of face down in the water. His name escapes me now, and I feel bad for
Aylan
even.
Kurdi, yeah.
Thank you. And I mean, but it's just that image sticks, and it stays, and you feel the pain. It's interesting you're saying that. I mean, we always hear about statistics and numbers and sort of figures, and that doesn't have any emotional resonance. It's shocking, but it doesn't sort of hit the way that sort of one child's tragic end does. So you in a way, I'm getting from you that no matter how much reporting on the actual numbers and the real sort of damage, it was the human story that was more effective in delivering what was happening.
Absolutely. I mean, there's just such a dehumanizing element to saying, 2 dozen people were killed, right? The website I work for now, is called Al Hudud. Right? They're an Arabic satirical news site,
Yes.
and one of their most powerful black comedy articles is an article about a bombing in Iraq, that in one go. It was at the time when there were a lot of bombings happening in Iraq, when ISIS had, was like in the immediate, aftermath of ISIS taking over, large swaths of Iraq. And one of the articles said, single bombing in Iraq claims daily quota of victims. And the idea was to kind of like illustrate how, the coverage internationally is about like, it's like, 100 people died today, 150 people died today. There's no immediacy or there's no, those people all had names. Those people are all, they're somebody's, son, daughter, husband, wife, mother, father. So many stories were broken, and so many, were cut, and so many dreams were cut short by this bombing, and they don't even get the just the generosity of recognition that their lives have ended. The value of human life can feel so shallow in the Middle East, and so worthless. I remember, during in 2017 when I went to Syria to cover the chemical attack in Khan Sheikhoun in 2017, we were in a car with the militia that was escorting me to the site of the bombing. And one of the guys there made a joke about how they should kidnap me and try to ransom me instead of actually taking me to the bomb site, because that would be more profitable to them. And I said, well, I'm Egyptian, nobody's going to pay you anything, which was true, and everybody laughed about it. um and they made the joke that well, they should treat me really well, and then once I leave, they'll be able to like bring in more foreigners and maybe kidnap them, and they'll be worthwhile to ransom. But I constantly understood that, and I constantly felt that lack of value that was placed in human life. And so whenever there was one of these traumatic incidents, I always tried to zoom into individual things or signifiers that indicated how whether it was the resilience of people or the scale of loss, or something of the sort. And that's
you almost kept that New York Times journalist's story intact with you, because that's the first sort of I can see the story. I can almost smell it. I know the sounds of that kind of story, and that's sort of it's almost like a template that you can use later for different tragedies, almost like a storytelling technique, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't think of it as a technique so much, or like as a as a sort of like structured way to go about it. I just wrote about what I remembered from the scene, or the things that stuck with me, right? So I mean, the thing I remember this particular bombing that had happened in Beirut. I think it was in Bir Hassan, and the bombing was in February 2014.
14,
yeah. And it was a double bombing. There was one attempt that had so it was two vehicles. The first one targeted an Iranian cultural center, and the second one was supposed to strike at the people who had gathered to help the wounded afterwards. But the force of the first explosion was so powerful that both explosions happened almost simultaneously. The second car was in front of an orphanage when it blew up, and we hadn't realized that when we got to the scene of the attack. And so we're interviewing people who were eyewitnesses and so on, and then all of a sudden this line of kids just emerges out of a side door, and they come out, and apparently they had been having a birthday party, and it was like, because most of them were orphans, nobody really knew when exactly they were born, and so they had one birthday party every year for everyone, and it happened to be on that day that they were having it, and unfortunately none of them were killed in the attack, but they came out, and some of them still had like markers on their faces, and I think some clown noses and things like that, and they were crying.
It's such a bizarre scene.
And
amidst the carnage, this sort of
exactly. But it's the one thing that sticks with you, right? It's it's those moments that really stick with you. In the same bombing, I went back that evening or the next evening to interview some more people about how they were picking up their lives. And there was this. I went up to one of the apartment buildings that was very close to the bombing, and the railing had been blown off of the balcony. But I went upstairs and I started interviewing there was an elderly man who was living there, and his daughter was there, and they had set out two chairs and a table and a pot of coffee out on the balcony that was basically just didn't have like any separation between it and the street, and they were setting it up because they were going to spend an evening just reminiscing on the balcony, and all the while their apartment was completely smashed to bits and everything was just broken and all over the floor. So it was always those moments that really stuck with me, and what I tried to do was always just to tell those stories, because they're the stories that stuck with me and that felt like they mattered, more so than why in the grand scheme of things we're trying to make sense of it, or why were people being this way to one another. It felt more immediate and more real to talk to people in the person rather than in the abstract, and to treat their lives as part of a game of chess.
But okay, so this is now, I mean, this is during in a way, Lebanon's own suffering when it came to the Syrian war, the spillover into Lebanon. And then you're sort of also at 2017, you're in a way reporting on a very dangerous turn of events in Syria, a repeated chemical attack. And the accountability side of the story. Did you at any point see that all this sort of human tragedy, that there would be justice at the end of the day, that there was going to be some change on the ground, there would be a political restructuring, there would be some level of reform? Was there any sort of light at the end of the tunnel? Because all of these stories are ones of, it's sort of like an increase in despair. There's very little to look forward. There's very little hope in this sort of wider story. So did you ever sense that there was going to be a good ending to all that you were seeing and reporting on?
Once I started reporting on Syria, no. I mean, that remains the thing that just nags at me the most. The fact that so many of these, lives were cut short, dreams that were severed, that nobody's going to pay for it. That it's going to continue with impunity, and there will never be a proper accounting for what's going to happen. The way it's going right now.
You sensed that at the beginning of your reporting on Syria, you felt that this was a fact on the ground, so to speak.
When I started reporting on Syria, the situation was much more fluid militarily. It seemed just as likely that the regime in Syria might collapse as as it might win. Like there was no clear path to an end game in the conflict yet, and so things were basically up in the air, and so we were quite busy sort of reporting on. We were consumed by the military developments that were going on, which were quite significant at the time. The rebels had taken over large pieces of territory. Eventually, by the end of 2015, which is early 2015, is when I started working on Syria for The Guardian. By the end of the year, the Russians had intervened, right? So and they eventually would turn the tide of the war completely. So at a time when the rebels were, the ascendants for most of 2015, by the end of the year, the tide had turned, and the Russians had intervened and rescued Assad. And once we got to 2016, we started seeing like the major campaigns that were starting to unfold, really brutal campaigns to reclaim, various parts of the country, like Aleppo, like Eastern Ghouta, afterwards, Damascus suburbs, and now, Idlib. So when I started covering it, it was very much about like what are the latest military developments, in which direction are the trends of the fighting, going, and less of a focus on how things were unfolding for real people on the ground, right? This was with the exception of areas that were under ISIS control, because there were repeated I hate to call them that, but repeated photogenic atrocities. The destruction of heritage. The spectacular executions that they were carrying out. And they were very much in the ascendance at the time, and very much the obsession of Western policymakers and Western media outlets. So there was a very strong focus on that particular element of the crisis, and everything else became a sideshow, to most people following Syria abroad. When in reality, what was happening with ISIS was, a symptom of just how cruel the conflict had become, and was just kind of sucking the oxygen out of every other element of the conflict that was unfolding, and that was very real, and that involved Syrians suffering on an enormous scale. So even
the audience's patience had already sort of run out by then. That there was little.
I
Yeah.
mean, when you think about it, like, it was very complicated to write anything about Syria,
Yeah.
particularly when, you went on to sort of when Turkey would, eventually intervene militarily in the conflict as well, and sort of the Kurds became, a really important component of the conflict because they, eventually allied with the US to fight against ISIS. To try and write a basic news story about Syria, involved something like 500 words of exposition and explanation, and about 100 words that you had to actually tell people what had happened.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
it became, eventually became really difficult to do any of that. And, as the regime sort of, with the assistance of Russia, began reclaiming territory and began launching all these like incredibly brutal campaigns to take back control of various parts of the country. The focus then went back onto the suffering of ordinary humans, who were trapped under siege in a place like eastern Aleppo or in eastern Ghouta or in
Yeah.
Madaya, the town that
Yeah.
was starving to death. And so that's all I had wanted to do, and covering that really gave me an insight into just how cruel people can be to each other. But it also showed me that justice was an incredibly elusive concept for us in the Middle East. That that trip to Syria to cover the chemical attack, um, uh, the main story I tried to tell in the articles I wrote from there were about this man Abdul Hamid Al Yusuf, who had lost two infant children in the chemical attack, as well as his wife and a number of other members of his family. I think in total there were about 18 or 20 who had died in the attack. And the realization after I left that nobody was ever going to pay for the fact that his two infants, died before their time, was incredibly shocking to me, and it's something I spent a lot of time, wallowing over, in the intervening months between then and when we ended up moving to Canada, because I just kept going back to that moment and realizing that for a lot of people, the only justice that they hope to see is justice in the afterlife, and they're not going to get it now.
I don't want to get. I mean, I don't want to push too hard on this. You say as much as you'd like. Did it take its toll on you to the point that you moved to Canada? Is that part of the story here that it was just too much to take as a reporter?
Um, I think it played a role. I mean, up until that point, look, I mean, it's the our immigration decision was complicated and involved the fact that I'm Egyptian, my wife is Syrian, and we had the opportunity to immigrate, and we didn't want, if we had a kid, for him or her to have an Egyptian passport or a Syrian passport. That was certainly an important aspect of it. Particularly by the time I left Turkey, the sentiment was turning decisively against Syrians in the country. It became more challenging to and the realization that we were vulnerable because of the passports we held and because of the lack of human life attached to those passports, was an important component in making that call.
So things, in a way, things lined up at the right time to do that move, despite of the reporting per se. It was all, yeah.
But for a while, I mean, we didn't really. I mean, it took a while for us to come to that conclusion, and I was quite reluctant. I mean, I was enjoying a great career with the Guardian. We had a lot of friends. We were able to travel. We were relatively well off, compared to a lot of people around us. And yet, like every time, like every night I spent on the balcony just sort of thinking about the latest story I had written, or the latest group of people to perish, for no discernible reason, just filled me with this realization that we are so small, and that we don't matter, and that, if anything happens, we won't matter, and
That's
nobody's
that's
gonna.
your astronomy side speaking, that you're insignificant at the end of the day.
Yeah, but I wish I was insignificant in the grand scheme of the universe, because
Right.
I can
Absolutely.
understand that because of the
Yeah.
scale, right?
Sure.
Um,
Absolutely.
but but it's so difficult when you realize that your life is essentially worthless to the people in charge, and that your life won't really matter, if it were to be taken away, or if it were to be crushed.
Yeah.
We were covering stories of that all the time, right? And
Right.
and so
Yeah.
and it wasn't a huge stretch to imagine yourself in the same situation if you did not have, the backing of an institution like the Guardian, or if you were,
Sure. Sure.
just sort of like living somewhere without, the level of protection that exposure in international media affords you,
Right.
and so it made sense to invest in being a citizen somewhere where that mattered, and where that had meaning to it, and where that afforded you a level of protection that you couldn't have otherwise.
That's well said, and I think anyone. I mean, I'm glad it ended up. It worked out at a time, I think, where probably it was. I mean, the Syrian story has such a bad ending, and I think, yeah, I think it's just it speaks volumes that you cannot sort of be in Syria today having witnessed 10 years of positive change. Instead, it's 10 years of immense pain and suffering, and maybe it does require some distance at this time, in a way to step back and maybe heal to a degree. Before leaving that subject, I just want to touch on one thing, which was, you're now in the West, you're in Canada. We spoke about Russia getting involved, Iran and other countries sort of stepping in, and we also touched on Hezbollah's role, and then ISIS and all that. The American chapter to the story, it kind of goes back to where we started at the beginning. Is it a justified disinterest in what's happening? Is there any sympathy to America's reluctance to get involved, at least on the almost what we would consider probably the bare minimum, which is preventing further human suffering, not letting this turn into the worst chapter in Middle East history, modern Middle East history? Is there anything about the American attitude that is, in a way, one could say is justified and makes sense?
Oh yeah. I mean, like, I understand the instinct, absolutely. I mean, if I was in any sort of decision making, capacity, I very much doubt that, I would make the case for why, American troops need to intervene in a faraway conflict that, did
Yeah.
not seem to have an obvious sort of, national security interest. Plus, I don't think anybody could have really, foreseen quite the level of destruction and cruelty that would unfold as part of the conflict. But I
Yeah.
will say this, though. I think that having international law means something. I think that having a collective understanding of universal human values matters and means something.
Mm.
I think the responsibility to protect ordinary human beings from butchery is something that should mean something.
Mm.
Um, and international law, part of it is, part of it is appropriated through, like, Security Council resolutions and whatnot, but part of it is customary, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like what we agree collectively as an
Mm-hmm.
international community is okay to do,
Yeah.
right? And if it's not okay, for people to, bomb their own civilians with toxic gas, then there should be consequences to that.
Right.
There should
Yes.
be consequences to something like bombing hospitals.
Absolutely.
There should be consequences to, besieging human beings and starving them to death.
Yeah.
All of these things should have consequences, because we don't want to live in a world in which it's okay to bomb
Mm-hmm.
hospitals and
Mm-hmm.
to,
Mm-hmm.
toss chlorine and sarin at people. And what international inaction in Syria has done is that enough hospitals have been bombed, enough people have died,
Yeah.
that all of these norms have been eroded,
Yeah. Yeah.
and they no longer matter in the grand
Right.
scheme of things. And this is something that matters globally. The fact that this cruelty was tolerated and this impunity was allowed to go on led to this enormous movement of people who were fleeing, really immense violence that is unimaginable to individuals who did not live through the Syrian war inside Syria. And that led to the amplification and the emergence into the mainstream of all these populist, nationalist, xenophobic, anti-immigrant movements in the West. And it's almost, it's the whole idea behind a butterfly wing flap leads to a hurricane halfway around the world. This decision not to enforce the rules-based international order that we were all supposed to believe in, led to this mass movement of people that eventually led to the undermining of the international rules-based order.
Right. So that is like almost an expectation that we all took for granted, that there would be some consequence to that kind of attack on human population. The fact that there was very little, if any, has sort of made the conflict much, much harder and made other conflicts much more likely down the road.
Absolutely. And it's made the cruelty that is likely to unfold in those conflicts, more real, because there was no consequence, there was no punishment for all the atrocities and the war crimes and crimes against humanity that took place in Syria. And ultimately, it would have been the decent thing to do to protect human beings from that sort of suffering. We made promises, like as international communities, right? Never again, that we weren't going to allow things like the genocide in Rwanda to repeat itself, things like the wars in the former Yugoslavia to repeat themselves, the Holocaust to repeat itself. And we shirked that responsibility, and never again doesn't really mean anything anymore.
I mean, there's always talk about that, the bare minimum, which would have been a no-fly zone over parts of Syria. Did any, let's say the basics, did you expect those things to happen at some point? Was there almost this is inevitable, the Americans will have to get involved to some degree at some point? Or were you able to kind of see at the beginning that there's really just no interest here, that we're headed towards real tragedy?
Yeah, it wasn't entirely clear what the justification was for why, something as basic as a no-fly zone was never implemented. We reported on, particularly Turkey was pushing very hard for it because, the fact that a lot of the people who were fleeing the bombardment were fleeing into Turkey.
Absolutely.
And this was a question that was always on the agenda. The Turks always, pushed for it, as far as we could tell, as a possible way to ameliorate the crisis as it was unfolding, and it just was never taken seriously as something that was likely to do. There were always reasons not to do anything about what was happening on the ground. The tragedy, of course, is the fact that Turkey then went ahead and imposed a no-fly zone in February, as part of its retaliation campaign against the Syrian regime, and did so with minimal loss of life or military equipment, and it became clear that all the arguments against a no-fly zone to protect civilians, such as it's going to be dangerous, it could spark a war with the Assad regime, it could expose our planes to to being taken down or to being destroyed. All that was complete nonsense. The Syrian army is decrepit and has zero capacity to actually resist any form of no-fly zone that was going to protect civilians. And it's a shame that it took so many years and so many hundreds of thousands of lives to realize that the bare minimum could have been done to protect so many people.
There is a document. It's all the years of reporting. It's the hard work a lot of reporters did when it came to at least exposing the human side. I think you are part of that wider story. I'm glad you're still a reporter technically, even though you're not reporting per se there on the ground about Syria. You've turned to satire. Satire is a different weapon altogether. And I just want to wrap it up by asking you, this world of satire, do you see the maybe broadly the politics in the Middle East, the moments that I've kind of stepped out of my own cocoon is when there's humor involved, and it could be humor in the most obvious ways. It could be Bassem Youssef, for example, making direct fun at the regime, and then unfortunately getting kicked out of Egypt as a result. It could be the Lebanese ways of chanting on the streets.
Yeah.
Sometimes we come up with melodies that are quite vulgar, but they're hilarious, and they often involve someone's mother's something. These are funny, and I think all of that is sort of there's delivery that you get somewhere with these moments. Do you see the power in comedy, in satire, and is it also does it feed into the moment that this sort of beyond that example you gave earlier about the Iraqi sort of statistics page? Is it sort of does it add fuel to the fire of dignity, of reform, of basic demands on the streets, that this is part of that? Or is it simply just a sort of it's like a side story, that this is sort of just a reflection? It's not really sort of there on the streets.
I mean, I don't think any satirist would grant himself the the power that you ascribe to what they do. But
Yeah.
you are right. I mean, the absurdity of everything that happens is insane, right? I mean, we have sometimes days when there's a feature that we have called Laytah al-Hudud, which is when something ridiculous happens but is real, and we
Yeah.
publish it and we say, like, we wish we would have come up with this story, right? But we didn't. And there are so many days when there are stories like that in the news that we just sort of look at it and we're like, what? Why didn't we come
It's
up with
almost
this idea?
comedic on its own. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there are various elements to it that are really important. So the most important thing, I think, is to punch up, right? It's worthless to like make fun of people who are weak or
Yeah.
don't have control over their destiny, right? You should always punch up towards the authorities, and towards the power structures in society. And this just does not just involve people who are in power literally, as in they're holding political office, but also structures like patriarchy, that empower males and disempower women. All these, the racism that in the Gulf, puts down migrant workers. All these various elements that add up to callousness in society against weaker individuals. You need to punch up to resist that. I think when we make fun of, particularly at this moment, right? I mean, the Lebanese protest movement, the Sudanese protest movement, the Algerian protest movement, they broke this to a certain extent. I wouldn't say they broke it, but they chipped away at this barrier of fear that had been erected in the aftermath of the counter-revolutions in the Arab Spring. We lost the physical spaces, right, in which we could protest and in which we could, have these conversations about what our societies ought to look like. And so we had to move a lot of those conversations onto the virtual sphere. We're getting back there thanks to, the Lebanese protest movement and other vanguard movements that really captured the imagination of Arabs again, but it's still really difficult to go out and protest in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia. So the Lebanese, Sudanese, and Algerian protest movements, they all started chipping away at this barrier of fear that had been erected after the aftermath of the counter-revolutions, throughout the Middle East, that pushed back against the demands of the Arab Spring, and so we've had to move a lot of those conversations off of the physical squares onto virtual platforms and networks, so that we can have those conversations about what are the issues that affect our societies, about what our societies ought to look like, and so we need to have those conversations somewhere, and we can't have them in the physical space. What satire does is that it strips away, points at the emperor and says the emperor is absolutely naked and has no clothes, and that helps break that barrier. one other really valuable aspect of it, I think, though, is the fact that it lets us interrogate, beliefs that we have, without beating us over the head with it. It's just
Yes.
it mocks, societal actions or norms that ought to be wrong. But in such a way that, like, do you really think that you should be doing this? Do you really think what you've got
Right.
there is right? One of the most popular articles in Al Hudud, I think, was a piece about a child who was born to parents of the right religion. Um, it was like, lucky baby born to parents of the right religion, right?
So
And it doesn't, at no point in the story does it
does it
specify
acknowledge
what their religion,
Sure.
what their religion actually was. Um, and there are multiple articles about sexual harassment, for example. So there's an article about a man who opened a popcorn stand for all the bystanders who sit and watch the sexual harassment unfold in front of them. And
It's actually very smart. This is actually it's sharp, and it's really it like you said, it punches up. It's
it
sort
is.
of yeah.
And it's important to be able to I don't want to use the word educate people, because that's not what's happening. It's just kind of you're almost creating like a peer pressure sort of thing. Like, it's not cool. That's not cool. Like, you shouldn't,
Right.
really, like, that's what you're doing. I think there was a piece about how I think people were angry that because of the racism that was directed against them abroad, when they're the ones who should be able to practice racism against migrant workers in their own country.
So it's really there's always a truth in that story, that there's something there that is real, and you're just sort of you're making it more accessible by making us laugh at the absurdity.
Yeah. I mean, recently with the Corona thing, we did a series of articles about a guy whose initials are Kaf Alif. And this guy, goes out regardless of warnings that he needs to stay at home so that he doesn't, and he's this brave young man, who goes out anyway because he's not scared of a puny, shitty little virus. And so we wrote an article telling him about, why he should stay at home anyway. And then the next day we wrote another article, admonishing this asshole, who's going out despite, the article we wrote the day before telling him to stay at home.
It's almost like a poetic force that adds, it's like sort of a neighbor to the political force that we see. It's like
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, don't get me wrong. We spend a lot of time, taking the piss out of, political authorities, right?
Sure.
I mean,
yeah. There's some risk here. Is it a newspaper that's published out of one of these countries? Or
so most of the primary outlet is online. I mean, most of our following is online, on our social media accounts. But we also have a membership program in which people can sign up and get the print edition, like a monthly print edition delivered to them.
But it's not based out of one of these. It's not a Gulf country operation. It's
I'd say.
Okay. Well.
No, it's not in the Gulf, but no, I mean, it's we would have to keep where they operate, confidential. But it is the paper itself is published out of London, and so it gets distributed from there to various parts of the world.
Right. Okay.
But yeah, I mean, it's look, it's been really hard to mentally separate what's going on in in the Middle East. And right now, obviously, everybody's thinking about Corona instead of all the conflicts that we were reporting on before that. And we're trying to, at the moment, also just let people laugh a little bit, and kind of let them breathe, and not constantly panic and live in the anxiety of thinking about a pandemic that they can't control.
Yeah.
But it has been a really valuable way to feel engaged with what's going on in the Middle East without having to necessarily be there, and to be able to spend some time to reflect on what's going on, because reporting on the region is incredibly draining, and it's really hard to take care of yourself, because obviously the people that you're reporting on are enduring so much more than whatever it is you're going through, just by retelling their stories. They're the ones who are living the actual stories, right?
Sure.
And so it's been a very healthy way of kind of pouring in some of that energy into something that is not just focusing on the misery that has happened, and focusing on it without seeing a real impact or real change in the situation of the people that you're reporting on. One of my colleagues, Josie Ensor, who
I was actually going to mention, she was an old roommate of mine.
There you go.
Yeah.
I mean, she wrote this wonderful piece, and it was a really heartbreaking piece about, looking back at this body of work and realizing that none of it mattered, that none of it made a difference,
That must have been her final piece for The Guardian, from not
not for the Telegraph.
For the Telegraph. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It was sort of a piece just looking back at her years of doing incredible journalism for them in the region, and and it is something that makes you wonder, like, what was the purpose of all of that? Like, but you can't let yourself think in those terms, because it's not your job to necessarily change the world, and if that's what you're hoping out of being a journalist, you're going to be disappointed. But it does, when you talk to people, and you realize that that they let you into their lives to for a brief moment, to tell you of the things that they've endured and the things that they suffered through, and that all you have to offer is words in ethereal words in a publication somewhere. And they continue to suffer in the aftermath, and you continue to witness that and to see it.
I mean, for endless reasons, your reporting and many other journalists' reporting at least will help shape how we look back on this moment. And as long as it would be a major defeat if the regime ends up winning that narrative, and I don't think they will long run. And it will have all these sort of all these reports, all these documents to prove otherwise, to say that no, this is what happened, and the world should learn from this very, very big mistake. And I'm going to share your links to the episode. I want sort of people to know your storytelling craft and that human component, and I'll also link up Al-Hudud satire as well, so people can laugh too. They can laugh, they can cry, they can sort of learn more about you that way. I really hope, Kareem, for me this is fantastic. We covered 90 minutes of terrain. We did it through video on a whim. I asked you to do this minutes before we started recording, if you'd be okay with video. We both look rather barbaric, but that's fine. Coronavirus is allowing us to degrade at home. We're properly domesticated, so that's fine. As long as you're showering once every few days, I think it's okay.
I think that should be okay. You wash your hands so much often anyway, so it doesn't. Plus, I think extraordinary times call for extraordinary beards.
Time to time, and maybe in a month.
Yeah, I hope if we do like a second iteration of the show, like I will try to make sure that I'm wearing a different shirt.
It would be very bad if we both look like this, just with
exactly the same.
More of that, yeah. But regardless, Kareem, this was a thrill for me, and I look forward to seeing you in person once this pandemic passes. So thank you for your time.
It was an honor for me, and such a wonderful opportunity to connect with you, and I'm truly grateful for what you do and for the example you've set to so many human beings, because you're a good human being, and we need more of you.
I'll say the same back to you, Habibi. So we'll speak soon.
Thank you, Ronnie.